but the simple political will that is necessary not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced.
We believe that as science says that we will very likely overshoot 1.5, we have to relook at the whole range of options. Mitigation, of course, remains the number one avenue, and there's no discussion about this, and I don't think anybody disagrees with that. Then we have to relook at the three other ones, which is adaptation, carbon removal, and geoengineering / solar radiation modification. And this commission has as a purpose to table new recommendations, given that what happens between 1.5 and 2 is quite dramatic. New proposals to better handle adaptation, move up carbon removal, and look at the science and governance part of geoengineering.
In this ClimateGenn episode, recorded on the last night of the extended COP in Sharm El Sheikh, Egypt, I'm speaking with the US COP veteran and legal expert, Professor Dan Bodansky from Arizona State University. Dan has extensive experience working with the US negotiating team over the years and shares his insights as to what motivates negotiators and how the nature of the COPs themselves is changing from bureaucratic conference to mega COP jamboree, where the circus atmosphere leeches into the proceedings and influences the outcome. However, none of this appears to be stemming the rise of global emissions to hold below 1.5 degrees Celsius, the scientific red line that is commonly used to measure the effectiveness of climate policy. As the breakdown of trust between global North and South countries continues to haunt the talks, a new think tank appeared at COP27 called the Overshoot Commission, tasking itself with looking at navigating a climatically unstable world. With geoengineering in the form of carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management firmly back on the table, Dan highlights that these investigations are currently about the exclusion of technologies that will not deliver, rather than the selection of technologies for deployment. The clock ticks and the world is moving into new territory on multiple fronts. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please check the GenCC website for full COP27 interviews and session lists, and Patreon backers will have access to extra content collected from the conference. Dan, I just want to start by asking you, especially at this time, we're coming to the end of the COP, and it's been variously labelled a circus, a junket, a big party, but at its core, what are the processes that have been most effective, do you think, and that are still delivering today, and what you might be able to reference even from right now?
So first of all, I think it's all of those things. I like to call it a tale of two COPs, because there's the COP as the official meeting of the parties deciding issues under the different treaties, and then there's the COP as sort of mega event with all this media and civil society organizations, activists, and so forth. So it's all of those things. So I think both have a role to play, maybe at different times. So I think at certain times, the actual processes of the COP, the official meeting side of it's been extremely important. For example, the negotiation, adoption of the Paris Agreement, the adoption of rules for how Paris are going to work. So I think even though Paris is not probably going to be enough, it's still essential. So negotiating Paris, getting it agreed, that was key, and that was the official process. But I think increasingly the official process has played itself out to some degree. We have Paris. Now they're arguing about some, the arguments are frequently about very, very arcane issues. So I think there's the other side of the COP, which is the unofficial part of the COP. The sort of mega event part of it also plays a big role. So it sort of provides a focal point for different groups to be pushing for things. It directs a lot of public attention on the issue and puts pressure on governments to sort of come forward and do things. So last year, the official part of the process did some things, but the unofficial part I think was probably more important. The pledge to reduce methane by 30% by 2030, for example, the pledges by different sectors to try to decarbonize. So all of that doesn't directly come out of the COP process, but I think without the COP process, there wouldn't be that kind of energy and push to try to get those things done.
Okay. So you've been around the COPs for a long time.
Right.
And you were just talking about these pledges made in Glasgow, for example. Over the years, how many of these pledges are actually materialized and how many of them vanish by the wayside?
So I think the pledges are a relatively new phenomenon, all of these different pledges by non-state actors or by governments. So I think so far there's not enough of a track record to know. I think one thing that I thought was heartening was learning more about the process that the climate champions are using. So the climate champions are the two officials who are appointed to try to mobilize non-state action. And so it's not just a question of getting them different actors to make pledges. There's now a fairly robust peer review process where the different sectors, in order to be listed under the climate champions race to zero, they have to come forward with methodologies. The methodologies are reviewed. There's reporting requirements. So actually, I think I've been somewhat skeptical about whether any of this stuff is really real and it's going to deliver. But I think there's a more serious process to try to monitor and verify, introduce some rigor into the process. So I think it's too early to say.
Okay, and that's interesting as well because from the outside, I think it's perceived as this one sort of big clunking process. But what you're saying is that there are different facets going on.
Oh, yeah.
And they're delivering lots of different things that accumulated.
Yes, I think there's a lot of different things going on. So I think just focusing on the discussions about the cover decision that may or may not be adopted later tonight, isn't really probably the most important thing going on. For example, here at Sharm El Sheikh, a number of countries put forward what's called a JETP, a Just Economy Transition Partnership with Indonesia, involving mobilizing $20 billion to try to decarbonize the Indonesian economy. So that's not part of the official process, but assuming that $20 billion really does materialize, that's putting a lot of money into one country to try to help it decarbonize its economy in a just way. So that's the kind of thing. It's too early to say whether they will be effective and work, but I think they're probably in some ways, a bigger story coming out of this COP than the official decisions adopted.
Okay. I'm getting a lot of emails right this second saying COP on the brink of failure. How would you respond to these kinds of press releases and press things, which are, they're getting traction on Twitter and social media?
So I think it's too much focus on the official process and not focusing enough on the other stuff that's going on here, like the announcement regarding Indonesia, $20 billion. So I think part of the problem is every COP now is perceived as having to deliver some, amazing new thing as part of the official process. And it used to be the case that you had sort of big COPs, what we call, and then we had what we called mini COPs, which were sort of just routine things where there didn't have to be a huge output coming out of it. This COP, going into the COP, actually there was no decisions really that had to be made at this COP because last year a number of work streams were established that are supposed to end up next year at the COP. So the one in Dubai next year is sort of the end point of these processes. So this was more like a way station on the way to the next year's COP. So the fact that it might not deliver any major new outcomes isn't so surprising. Now, actually, this COP has turned into a much more important COP because small island states, vulnerable countries have really put the issue of loss and damage on the table. And so even though this COP doesn't, as part of its official agenda, have to deliver anything because that's really for next year, AOS has said, basically a prerequisite for this COP was that it adopts some financing decision on loss and damage, and it actually looks like it's likely that will happen later tonight. So that's actually, to me, a bit of a surprise and actually is a more significant outcome from this COP. So if you had asked me, a year ago whether this COP was going to establish a fund to address loss and damage, I would have said, no way. But AOS has put it on the table in June at the intersessional meetings, and then it looks like, can't really say it for sure until the decision's adopted, but it looks pretty likely that the COP is going to adopt a decision addressing financing of loss and damage, including establishing a new fund. So, and that's one of the official outcomes from the meeting. So if that actually takes place, that will be actually a pretty significant development addressing, the huge concerns of least developed countries, other vulnerable countries about the losses they're suffering from climate change.
Yeah, that's a majorly good thing. And do you think then that coming back a step, that what we were talking about before, the junket, the circus,
Right.
the 40,000 plus people
Right.
that have turned up here, that
Right.
they've been influencing. There is no small COP anymore. Every COP, there's a lot of eyes, there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of determination and willpower.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, I think it's the good side is it puts pressure on countries and companies and others to come forward and announce something. The downside is if nothing major happens, the expectations are very high. It raises expectations. So if you don't get something major, people say it's a failure. I mean, in most meetings of international environmental organizations, your typical year, there's no big new development. It's routine. So the idea that every year there has to be some new major output is, I think, a downside of having the mega COPs, because then people get disappointed, say the process is a failure. Whether the process is a success or failure doesn't necessarily depend on whether there's something major coming out of this process. It depends on whether or not states are actually implementing what they said they're going to do under the Paris Agreement.
It feels like we ought to have some idea of the sort of scale of these successes and failures as well. Yes. in the broader context.
Yes.
Where you were saying before, it used to be one big COP, then several little COPs, and then another big COP.
Yeah.
Do you think now that as the impacts of climate change are all around us and they're getting worse and worse and worse, the pace itself of everything is accelerating? It's just a thing where now we're going to have a lot more to talk about on an annual basis, whereas before it was all trying to look forward.
So, I mean, I think it's definitely the case that there's much more focus on climate change, and that's why every COP is a mega COP and why there's so much activity. I don't think it's necessarily the case that every year you have to announce 10 major new decisions. It's really more a matter of announcing a few things and then actually implementing them. And the implementation of them, may take several years. And so you might not get immediate feedback as to whether it's working or not. So I think there should be more focus on making sure that countries are actually implementing what they said they're going to do and what companies have said they're going to do. And so the kind of process that the champions have set up to do peer review of sectors that have made pledges under the Race to Zero, that doesn't get a lot of attention here, but actually is, making that effective and seeing what the results are is really key.
Yeah, because even the name sort of champion, it sort of sounds a bit ambassadorish as opposed to actually having a real meaning, doesn't it? So people look at it and think, what on earth is that? What's going on at the real?
Yeah, to me, I think when I first heard about it, it seemed a little bit like fluff.
Yeah.
And then when you saw the climate action portal where different groups can put up what their pledges are, there's no real accountability as to what the pledges mean, whether anybody's doing anything to implement the pledges. So it did seem a bit like greenwashing. So with the climate champions process, I just learned in conversations here, seems to be a much more rigorous process where they're not just trying to get companies to make pledges, they're trying to have companies or sectors come forward with methodologies as to how they would what it actually means to get to net zero, how you would monitor that, what the metrics would be for seeing whether they're making progress towards achieving that. So, that's a lot more substantive.
It's detail, substantive. Okay, and you've been involved in the past with the American negotiating team and played a role there. From your experience, what's the balance when you're in these talks between planet first, America first?
Well, I would say for every country who's here, they're trying to advance their national interests. So it's not really, it wouldn't be limited to the U.S. It would be every country has national positions and is trying to advance those. Now, to a significant degree, there shouldn't be a disjunction between America first and planet first, because every country has a stake in the planet surviving. So, hopefully there's not such a big difference. But I think the fact of the matter is, climate change affects different countries differentially. Countries have different economic interests in addressing climate change. countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels, it's more difficult for them to decarbonize, or maybe a significant source of income. So, their national interest. One of the things that makes this so complicated is, not everybody's national interests are not perfectly aligned. So, and I think countries, if you're a country representative, your job is to represent your country's interest as your political leaders, or see your country's interest. You're not acting as a ambassador for the planet. But hopefully, and I think this is the case for many countries, countries have an interest in addressing climate change and advancing. You're trying to address climate change in a way that's compatible with your country's interests. It's also the case that what you can do internationally is very much dependent on what is politically possible domestically. So if you just are saying planet first, you can make all sorts of statements here, but you're not going to be able to actually come back home and implement them, because you have to get things through your domestic political process. So
do you think that's a major hindrance for America?
I think that's a major hindrance for America, as well as for probably many countries. But yes, I think
America's very significant because of the size of its muscles.
Yes.
And
so
speaking to people from different countries, they have in the past always said, America is the one country that's really, pain in the backside when it comes to.
Well, I think what individual U.S. negotiators would like to see, what John Kerry would like to see, may not be what they're actually having to push for, because even if John Kerry supports X, if they can't get it through Congress or get it through the Senate, it's not going to happen. So you have to be realistic when and you have to. It doesn't help to be saying things internationally that you might agree with. It might be a good idea if you can't actually deliver on them back home. So you always have to be mindful of domestic politics. And when I was doing it, and I think this has been true always, is negotiating the Paris Agreement. You have to have a Paris Agreement that the U.S. can join. Because if the U.S. can't join the Paris Agreement, you might like a Paris Agreement that's much different from the actual Paris Agreement, but it's not going to be helpful to negotiate an agreement that then the U.S. stays out of. So I think a lot of the U.S. positions in the Paris Agreement, other agreements, are driven by, what the U.S. can join, and that's true of other countries too. No country is going to negotiate an agreement that they don't. Well, if you're negotiating in good faith, you should be trying to negotiate an agreement that you think your country is going to be able to join.
Okay. You're doing a lot of work in the legal side of interventions, climate interventions, aka geoengineering, which a lot of people don't like to talk about. Is this because you think we're going into crossing planetary boundaries territory?
I don't know about planetary boundaries. I'm not sure there are planetary boundaries. I'm agnostic on that. I'm not a scientist. I think we're unlikely to achieve the 1.5 degree goal that the Paris Agreement puts forward as an aspiration. Even at 1.1 degree, which is where we are now above pre-industrial levels, we're seeing massive harms from climate change. So 1.5, even if you achieved it, is not a magical solution. It seems like we're on track to somewhere north of 1.5, maybe above 2 degrees. So I think we're facing, serious climate damages. And so I think this process, you should try to do as much as you can under this process, under other initiatives like methane, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we need to be looking at all options. So if we're facing crossing tipping points and we're facing runaway climate change, we need to know, are there other ways of trying to address those? So I think it's prudent to be looking at climate intervention, climate engineering, because, we may need them. But they may not work, or they may be unsafe. So we're better off having done the research in advance, because the worst thing would be to try something in desperation that actually isn't effective or causes catastrophic harm. So I think we need to be understanding them now to see if they are a realistic option. Would they be effective? What would be their side effects? Because if and when, hopefully we won't need them, but, if we're going above 1.5 degrees, if we're potentially crossing tipping points, we need to sort of see what our options are and understand our options.
And from a sort of legal perspective, have you an idea or reached a sort of I don't know what the term is, discovery of like a pathway to deployment? Because at the moment we only ever talk about research. No one would dare say deploy. I don't think.
Well, yes. I don't think it's responsible to say deploy, because you wouldn't want to deploy something unless you understand it.
Yeah, I know, but I'm saying that, say you've got to go through all the stages. So everyone finally says, or at least some people say, look, these things are so bad, we have to do this, either unilaterally or multilaterally.
Right.
Is there a sort of legal framework evolving that sort of defines that process?
No, I don't think. I think right now, I don't think there is a legal framework for how you would deploy it. Generally speaking, there are not legal frameworks for many things, and countries just decide as a matter of national policy what they want to do. I would hope that on something like climate interventions, where you're affecting the entire globe, you consult with others first. You try to make it as multilateral as possible, but in the end, I think there's unlikely to be a process that is able to make decisions about whether to use geoengineering. So I think countries, hopefully in collaboration with others and with consultation and with transparency.
So you think ultimately it'll be not a unilateral decision, but it will be a national decision, hopefully with lots of others on board?
Yes, I think, I think
this is totally hypothetical.
The only existing institution that can address it is the Security Council, because the Security Council actually does have decision-making authority, and so I don't think there's going to be an ability to create another Security Council-like institution. So I guess to the extent we may need climate interventions in a country's thinking of going ahead, then I think the UN General Assembly and Security Council would be the forums where you would try to.
That's quite interesting.
Use it.
Because if you brought it to a place like this, you'd be looking at 27 years of slow pushing, and yet if you went to something like a Security Council, you could, and basically one would hope that in the end our only real challenge is facing climate change and not each other. That maybe that's a new role for the Security Council.
So
idealist, but
hopefully there will be enough information about geoengineering, and a country would only be thinking about using it in a clear case where it seems there's no other alternative than to use it. So there would be it wouldn't be that one country going ahead, there'd be some broader international agreement. But there wouldn't be a formal decision-making process, but there'd be significant buy-in from other countries. And then you'd want to be consulting with them and try to develop the broadest possible coalition to try to provide some reassurance that you're not just doing it for your own national interests.
But of course, in this scenario, you're going to be at something like probably 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 degrees, and things are not looking very pretty anywhere.
Right.
And it's a very different world. And what other options are there on the table when you cross those sorts of, this 1.567 boundary? Do you know of any others apart from these kinds of interventions that are on the table? I haven't.
No. So geoengineering is a broad term, so there are different types of interventions.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're all the same. Some of they'd all have to be of massive scale and have global effects, but some I think are more concerning than others, or are more unknown than others. Because some you could turn off more quickly. For example, if you try to brighten marine clouds, then you can turn that mechanism off and the clouds dim again pretty quickly. Whereas I think once you put the sulfur aerosols, I'm not sure how long they take to come out. But I think I'm not sure they all raise exactly the same issues, but I think they all need to be investigated thoroughly first before decisions are made about whether to use them.
I think there's a whole other interview around interventions, but that's good for that. Thank you very much.
With pleasure.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.